The law does not begin in a quiet chamber. It is not born on parchment. It is born in the moment of decision, when one man holds power over another. For the Mongol Empire, that moment was the aftermath of the siege, the silence after the final breach. It was here, amidst the ruin, that a new kind of law was imposed. A law that turned human beings into assets. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together of the Mongol Empire. When we think of the Mongol conquests, we often picture the physical destruction, the razed cities, the pyramids of skulls. But the true, lasting impact of the Mongol war machine was not just destruction. It was a systematic, legally grounded reorganization of the conquered. The most valuable resource to be gathered from a city like Samarkand, Urgench, or Kiev was not just gold or silk. It was the people. This is where the great Yassa of Genghis Khan enters the narrative, not as a simple code of nomadic ethics, but as a tool of empire. The Yassa, in its application, was the legal mechanism that transformed the chaos of slaughter into a deliberate, cold, and calculated harvest of human capital. Primary sources, from the Persian chronicler Juvaini to the accounts of Franciscan friars, describe a chillingly consistent process. After a city's surrender, or, more often, its fall, the population would be driven out onto a plain. There, the Mongol Tombed and Nayan, the commanders of divisions, would oversee a process of brutal categorization. We must understand this was not random looting. It was an administrative act. The Yassa provided the legal authority for this sorting. First, the population would be divided, often by a simple count of tens. Then, the classifications began. We can see in the records the clear priorities of the Mongol state. Artisans, engineers, metalworkers, weavers, and anyone with a specialized skill were pulled aside. These individuals were not to be harmed. They were too valuable. They were now, in effect, property of the Khan himself, or allotted to his chief commanders. They became Ulus Unbo-ol, slaves of the state, destined for deportation to the imperial heartland in Karakoram, or to other parts of the vast, expanding empire that needed their expertise. The Yassa functioned as the Khan's gavel, descending upon the battlefield to render a legal judgment. It distinguished between the useful and the useless. Those deemed of no immediate skill, the elderly, the infirm, and often the common farmers, were frequently put to the sword. This wasn't just cruelty, though it was certainly that. From the perspective of the Yassa, it was a practical matter. They were a drain on resources, a population that could not be easily controlled or utilized. Their extermination was a matter of state policy, a brutal form of resource management. Then there were the women and children. Young women and strong boys were segregated, their fate determined by their perceived value as wives, concubines, servants, or future soldiers. They were categorized as nukur or jilal, types of bondservants, their legal status instantly and irrevocably altered. They ceased to be a daughter of a merchant or a son of a farmer. They were now defined entirely by their relationship to their new Mongol master. The Yassa codified the right of the conqueror to not only seize this human property, but to define its new role. What the Yassa created in these moments was a legal framework for dehumanization. It provided the moral and philosophical justification for what was happening. A Mongol soldier was not simply kidnapping. He was executing the will of the Khan, adhering to the great law that stipulated all things and all people in a conquered land belonged to the victor. The law was the instrument that turned a human being with a family, a profession, and a history into a quantifiable object. One artisan, one concubine, one laborer. This immediate legal sorting had a profound psychological effect, one chronicled in the sources. It was the first death, the death of one's identity. The law, in this instance, was a blade that severed the individual from their past, their community, and their very personhood. They were no longer subjects of a Rus's prince or a Khwarezmian Shah. They were entries in a Mongol ledger. This process, repeated across Eurasia, from the plains of Hungary to the fields of Korea, was the foundational act of the Mongol yoke. It was not a yoke of abstract political domination. It was a vast, intricate, and legally defined machine of servitude, built one sordid captive at a time. The initial, violent sorting on the battlefield was merely the prologue. The true, enduring power of the Yassa was not in its immediate application, but in its meticulous codification of servitude as a permanent legal status. To understand the Mongol yoke, we must move past the fall of the city and enter the administrative tents and legal courts where the Yassa was interpreted. It was here that human beings were legally redefined as state assets, chattel, and transferable property. The Yassa was, at its core, a law of property. In the nomadic worldview from which it sprang, the greatest crimes were theft of livestock, of wives, of goods. Genghis Khan's genius was to apply this rigid framework of ownership to the vast, complex, and sedentary populations he conquered. The Great Law transformed the Khan from a mere conqueror into the supreme legal owner of the conquered. Everyone and everything, from the princes of Kiev to the peasants in the fields, became, by this new legal definition, the Khan's property. When we analyze the statutes, we find a clear and crucial distinction in this new legal hierarchy. The first and most valuable category was the Ulus un Bool, literally, slaves of the state, or slaves of the nation. These were the tens of thousands of skilled artisans, engineers, scribes, and administrators identified during the initial sorting. Their legal status is fascinating. They were not chattel to be sold at a whim by a minor soldier. They were a strategic imperial resource, belonging directly to the golden family of Genghis Khan. The Yassa dictated that their skills were to be used for the benefit of the Ulus, the Mongol state. Records from travelers like William of Rubruck describe encountering these men in the heart of the empire at the capital of Karakorum. He famously met a Parisian silversmith, Guillaume Boucher, who had been captured in Belgrade and was now serving the Great Khan. Boucher was not in chains, but he was not free. His life, his work, his every creation was legally owned by the Khan. He could not leave. He could not refuse his work. He was a state asset, managed with the same deliberate care as a prized herd of horses. This system allowed the Mongols to enact one of the largest forced technology transfers in human history, moving Persian weavers to China and Chinese siege engineers to the borders of Persia, all under the legal framework of Ulus-un Bo'ol. But below this artisan slave class existed the vast majority of captives who fell into the category of personal chattel. These were the men, women, and children divided among the Nyan and common soldiers as spoils of war. Here, the Yassa was brutally simple. It codified the master's absolute right. When we consult the legal records and chronicles, we find captives listed in inventories alongside armor, bolts of silk, and livestock. Their humanity was legally irrelevant. The law's function was to protect the owner's rights, not the property's status. A key statute in the Yassa, recorded by several chroniclers, stipulated the death penalty for anyone who gave food or shelter to a runaway slave. Think of the power of that statute. It transformed the entire conquered population into an enforcement mechanism. A peasant, himself living in subjugation, would not dare help a fugitive because the Yassa made the act of basic human compassion a capital crime. The law itself built the walls of the prison. This leads us to the critical concept of heritability. The Yassa ensured the system's longevity. The children of a Bo'ol were, by law, born into the same status. They inherited their parents' servitude. This created, for the first time in many of these regions, a permanent, legally defined, and self-perpetuating servile class. This status was distinct from the Islamic Mamluk system, which, in a paradox, could see a slave soldier rise to become a sultan. It was also different from European serfdom, where a person was tied to a specific piece of land. The Mongol slave was chattel, tied to a master, and could be moved, sold, or deported at will. The Yassa also legalized the open market in human beings. The great cities of the Golden Horde, like Sarai and Astrakhan, became some of the largest slave markets in the world. Here, the law governed the transaction. A slave was a commodity, and the Yassa provided the legal framework for their sale and transfer. A chronicler might note a commander gifting 1,000 captives to the Khan. This was not a figure of speech. It was a legal transfer of property, sanctioned by the great law. Rus's princes, in their position as vassals, were often forced to provide levies of slaves as part of their tribute, a tax paid in human lives, all under the guise of legal obligation. We must bust the myth that the Mongol system was crude or simple. It was not. It was a sophisticated, multi-tiered legal structure designed for the express purpose of extracting maximum value, labor, skill, and service from conquered populations. The Yassa did not just permit slavery, it engineered it. It created different grades and classifications, established clear lines of ownership, and used the threat of absolute state-sanctioned violence to ensure its enforcement. It was the legal code that turned the entire Mongol Empire into a vast, efficient, and horrifying machine of human exploitation. An empire built on the singular will of a conqueror is destined to fracture. And so it was. By the late 13th century, the vast Mongol Empire had broken apart into its successor states. The Ilkhanate ruled Persia. The Golden Horde dominated the Rus's principalities. The Chagatai Khanate held Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty governed China. The political unity was shattered, but the legal DNA of the Yassa, its specific cold framework for human ownership, endured. It did not die with the unified empire. It metastasized, proving itself remarkably adaptable. We see its most profound and lasting shadow in the lands of the Golden Horde. The Yassa, as applied by the Khans at Sarai, cemented the legal relationship of vassalage over the Rus's princes. But the system went far deeper than mere political submission. The Mongol concept of yassak, or tribute, was directly informed by the Yassa's foundational principle of the conqueror's total ownership of the conquered. When we consult the Rus's chronicles, we find the tribute was not just paid in silver or furs. It was frequently and legally demanded in human beings. This had a devastating, long-term legal consequence. The Yassa's framework, which treated populations as a manageable, taxable, and transferable resource, provided a grim and powerful model for the rising Muscovite state. Scholars continue to debate the precise lines of legal inheritance, but the correlation is chilling. The Muscovite legal codes that would emerge, the Sudebniki of the 15th and 16th centuries, codified a form of servitude, serfdom, that bound a peasant to a piece of land, and by extension, to a master. While certainly not a direct copy, the Mongol system had provided a powerful, large-scale, and recent precedent for the state's absolute legal right to control, restrict, and exploit the labor of its population. The Yassa had, in essence, normalized mass, state-enforced servitude in the region. In the Ilkhanate of Persia, the Yassa's legacy was different, colliding with the complex, ancient, and highly developed framework of Islamic Sharia. Sharia, of course, already had its own detailed rules regarding slavery, but the Yassa introduced the unique Mongol concept of the ulus-un-bo'ol, the state-owned artisan slave. When we examine the records of Ilkhanate rulers like Ghazan Khan, who famously converted to Islam and sponsored a renaissance of Persian culture, we find they did not abolish this Yassa-derived system. They adapted it. Vast state-run workshops, or karkhanas, were staffed by these enslaved craftsmen, their legal status still defined by Mongol custom, not purely by Sharia. Their servitude was to the state, not to a private individual. This demonstrates the Yassa's primary, overarching function. It was a tool of state building, designed to funnel the human resources of the conquered world directly to the new ruling elite. The human experience of this is recorded in the laments of Persian poets, who decried the Tartar laws that had overturned the natural order, placing the skilled and the learned in legal bondage. Perhaps the Yassa's most significant long-term legacy, however, was its role in fueling and structuring the international slave trade. The Golden Horde's great cities, Sarai and Tana, and the Genoese port of Kaffa in Crimea, became the largest slave markets in the known world. Here, the Yassa's cold codification of humans as chattel was essential. And here, we must draw a critical comparison. The Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt, the primary customer for these slaves, was itself a system where slaves could, paradoxically, achieve immense power. A Mamluk could become a general, even a sultan. The Yassa offered no such path. It was a legal trapdoor. A captive from the Rus lands or the Caucasus, sold in Kaffa under the legal authority of the Khan, was chattel. Their children would be chattel. The Yassa's codification of heritable slavery ensured a perpetual, legally simplified product for these markets. This entire economic and legal machine outlived the Golden Horde itself. When the Crimean Khanate rose from its ashes, it adopted this model as its core state industry. The devastating, centuries-long Crimean Nogai raids on Eastern Europe, which carried hundreds of thousands into slavery, were a direct continuation of the economic and legal logic established by the Yassa. The harvesting of captives was no longer an act of war. It was a state-sponsored, legally justified enterprise. So, when we trace the long, dark shadow of the Yassa, we find it is not just a relic of a nomadic empire. It is a chilling case study in the power of law to codify and perpetuate dehumanization. The Yassa statutes did more than just justify conquest. They created a lasting, transferable, and frighteningly efficient legal architecture for exploitation. It established a precedent that the state, through the power of its law, held the ultimate right to classify, own, deport, and sell human beings as property. It was a legal framework that treated people as a natural resource, to be harvested and managed like timber or grain. This idea, once codified and proven effective, would not be easily forgotten. The Yassa's true, terrifying legacy is the simple, enduring blueprint it provided for the legal machinery of servitude. The great codes of law, from Hammurabi to Justinian, are remembered for building societies. The Yassa is a haunting exception, a code remembered for its systematic unbuilding of them. It stands as a testament, etched in the chronicles of a dozen fallen nations, that the most enduring chains are not forged from iron, but from the cold, hard text of the law itself and the terrible human will to enforce it.